The position as the continent Atlantis occupied is that as between the Gulf of Mexico on the one hand and the Mediterranean upon the other. Evidences of this lost civilization are to be found in the Pyrenees and Morocco on the one hand, British Honduras, Yucatan, and America upon the other. The old record in Gizeh is from that as recorded from the journey to Pyrenees, and to 1998 from the death of the Son of Man, as a man. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods particularly, when there was the exodus from Atlantis owing to the foretelling or foreordination of those activities, which were bringing about the destructive forces. There we find the entity was among those who were not only in what is now known as the Yucatan land, but also the Pyrenees and the Egyptian. For the manners of transportation, the manners of communications through the airships of that period were such as Ezekiel described of a much later date. The entity was in the Atlantean land, in those periods when there were the preparations resulting from those activities, and disputes between the children of the law of one and the sons of Belial, so that the various groups were sent to the varied lands. The entity was among the children of the law of one, the mathematician, the one who made preparations for those journeys through the air to the Pyrenees. Later, with those establishings of the activities in Egypt, the entity took residence there, becoming associated with Ajax or Axtel in those experiences. The entity was in the Atlantean land, when there was the breaking up of the land, and when there was the journeying of those to the various lands for activities. There we find the entity first coming into what was called the Mayan land, or what is now Yucatan. With the establishing of the associations of many of the peoples, in which the entity was closely associated in the Atlantean land, in the Pyrenees, and in the Egyptian land, the entity was the first, in that period of experience, to cross the waters in the plane or air machine of that period. The entity was in that now spoken of as the Atlantean land, in those periods, when there were the beginnings of the breaking up of that land and the sojourning of those people to various other lands. The entity was among those who took up their sojourn in what is now Spain and Portugal, or the Pyrenees, and those activities there. The entity was in that known as the Atlantean land, in those periods, when there were the comings of those from Atlantis to first the Pyrenees and then portions into Egypt. The entity was in the Atlantean land, but among those groups dispatched to other lands at the time of destruction. With the entrance of the groups into Egypt, the entity was among those who had been in the Pyrenees. The entity was in that known as the Atlantean land, during those periods when many were making preparations for the changes from the land when the calamitous activities were imminent, through the activities of the sons of Belial, in opposition to those of the law of one. The entity then was among those peoples that were advanced from the various developments during that period, and was an expert in handling of the crafts of the day that made for the manners of escape by those that went to the different lands, as to the Pyrenees into Yucatan, and to the Egyptian land. The entity was in the Atlantean land, when there was the breaking up of the isles, and it had been given out that those who would or were to be saved must journey forth to the various centers to which the leaders had been given the passports. The entity was among those who came first to what is now the Pyrenees, and later to the activities, after they had been set up years before, in the Egyptian land. The entity was in the Egyptian land, but of the Atlantean peoples, when there was the exodus from Atlantis to what is now the Spanish or Pyrenees land, and then to Egypt. With the establishing of the coalition between the Egyptians and the Atlanteans, the entity, with those of Atlantis, who had been in authority, who came to the Egyptian land, eventually aided in those activities, as relating to the preparation of individuals. The entity was in the Atlantean land, when there were those changes being wrought, when the upheavals were known. The entity, with many of those that escaped to the various lands, joined in the exodus, first settling in the Pyrenees and then, with that establishing of the united effort on the part of the Atlanteans with the Egyptians, the entity entered into Egypt, and became acquainted with, associated with, those activities having to do with the vocational guidance, especially as presented in the temple beautiful services, and the temple's activity. The entity was in the Pyrenees land, or portions of Spain and Portugal, for in these were the activities of the entity following the destruction and the distributing of the peoples from the Atlantean land. The entity was a native of that land, or being born of those peoples in the land. The entity was in the Atlantean land, when there were the activities which brought about the necessity of the separating and the exodus of the peoples from the land, owing to those destructive forces brought about by the children of Belial. The entity was among those who chose rather to be known among the sons of the law of one, yet of the households of those in authority among the sons of Belial. These brought disturbing forces, yet the entity was among those who sojourned first in the land of the Pyrenees, and later in the Egyptian land, as there was the developing of the ideas, and the coalition of activities of the priest of the children of the law of one with Ra in the Egyptian development. The entity was in the Atlantean land, when there were those periods of preparation for leaving the land, through the teachings of the law of one, of which the entity was a member, and not only a member, but a princess in same. The entity held closer to the tenets, the teachings of that dependence of those in authority upon the higher influences that might enter through those days and seasons and periods of preparation for the receiving of the principle which had entered in. When the divisions came, the entity was among those who went into the Egyptian land, first in the Pyrenees land. The entity was in the Atlantean land, during those periods when there was the knowledge, through the teachers or leaders in the law of one, as related to the destruction of the Atlantean, or Poseidon land. And the entity was among those who journeyed from Atlantis or Poseidia itself, first to the Pyrenees or Portuguese land and later into what would be called in the present the Egyptian land, hence we find the entity then, Atlantean, as would be said in the present, was the first to set the records that are yet to be discovered, or yet to be had of those activities in the Atlantean land, and for the preservation of the data that is yet to be found from the chambers of the way between the Sphinx and the Pyramid of Records. The entity was in the land now known as or called the Pyrenees, or the land where the Atlanteans landed and combined their efforts in developments with the Pyrenees, the Carthaginians as later were known, or the Carpathians. In the activity there the entity was a leader, yet a seducer of those that were in authority, and became the ruler that allowed the creating of too much lewdness in the activities of the religious service and worship. The name then was Amy. The entity was in that now known as the Egyptian, or the Atlantean land, for the entity was among the Atlanteans who first came to Egypt. With the establishing of the varied groups for the expression and manifestation of what would be termed the arts in the present, the entity accepted same and aided in making the correlations of the teachings during the experience. So the entity journeyed then to what is now a portion of Portugal, or in the Pyrenees, where a portion of its own groups from the Atlantean land set up a form of worship and a temple activity. The entity was in the land now known as or called Egypt, yet the entity was a native of the Atlantean land, and one that made a visit and became active in many of the lands to which the Atlanteans went and made their various settlements in that period. Hence the entity was among the daughters of the law of one, being a priestess of the temple in the Poseidian land, among those that went to the Egyptian land with those peoples for the establishing of the associations, also visiting those that established themselves in now the Pyrenees, or the eastern portion of the continental Europe, and those that established themselves in what is now known as a portion of America, in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and those portions of the land. The entity was in what is now known as or called the Atlantean land, during those periods when there were changes. The entity then was among those who journeyed to what is now the Pyrenees, or the Portuguese or Spanish land. The entity was in the Egyptian land, as known in the present, during those periods when the peoples from the Atlantean land, or the Poseidon and Atlantean land, came with the destructive forces into the Egyptian, and brought the tenets of the law of one, the abilities to use the influences of nature for the activities in relationships to men for conveniences. The entity then, of the daughters of the law of one, came with Ajax, came with those who became as the leaders in establishing with the priest of the Egyptian land those activities, in which the individuals were fitted for special service owing to their individual faculties, and developments for individual service. The entity was in the Atlantean land. There we find the entity was very close to those in authority, being that one who was the keeper of the portals, as well as the messages that were received from the visitation of those from the outer spheres, in the latter part of the entity's experience there. For it was the entity that received the message, as to the needs for the dividing of the children of the law of one, for the preservation of the truths of same in other lands. Hence we find the entity was among those who were as the directors of those expeditions, or the leaving for the many varied lands, just before the breaking up of the Atlantean land. Hence the entity outlined in the most part, it might be said, the expedition guided by Axtel, and the ones to the Pyrenees, and to the Yucatan, and to the land of Og. There we find the entity then gave those communications that were established later by the entity from the Pyrenees, and later again established in the mountains in the Grecian land, and there those messages that called for the meetings of the nations were brought about by the activities of that entity during that sojourn. Later, with the revivifying of the priest in Egypt, the entity was among those who set about the unifying of the teachings of the Atlanteans, the Egyptians, as they would be called today, the Indian, the Indochinan, the Mongoloid and the Aryan peoples. All of those were the activities of the entity, for he was the messenger and the message bearer, or the means through which transmissions of activities were set up. The name then was Sigund. The entity was in the land now called the Poseidon, or Atlantean land, when there were the disturbances between the children of the law of one and the sons and daughters of Belial. The entity then was among those who sought the preservation of the records of the peoples of the law of one, and induced those divisions that were sent out as emissaries to establish in the various stages, or spheres of human endeavor those places for the preservation of such, the entity to the Pyrenees land, and did not reach the Egyptian, nor hear from the other expeditions, which the entity had caused to be established. The entity was in the Atlantean land, in those periods when the earth was being broken up, as far as the Atlantean land was concerned, and the entity came with those groups for search through other lands. The entity was among those who searched more than one place, to find those places to which there might be sent those who were to be saved. Hence there was a knowledge of the Yucatan land, as well as the settlings in the Pyrenees, as well as part of the activities in the Egyptian land. The entity was in the land now called the Atlantean, and especially of the Poseidon peoples, who were active when there were the preparations through the breaking up of the land, and the preserving of records, the activities for the use of those things that had been a part of the activity throughout the Atlantean experience. There we find the entity was with those groups who entered first into the Pyrenees, and then the Egyptian land. The entity was among the children of the law of one, and those who used the powers called in the present the natural sources, or the electrical forces, for propelling as well as for conveniences in the activities and appliances that might be used in the various fields to serve human needs. The entity was in the Egyptian land, when there were those activities that brought the Atlanteans into the land. The entity was a high priestess in the land of the Atlanteans, or among the last of the children of the law of one, the priestess Emizersia, with the overriding of the children of Belial. The entity almost by force was carried first into the Pyrenees land, or Spain and Portugal. Later, with the establishings of those associations in Egypt, and with the return of the priest, the entity was brought by Ajax, Axtel and the Egyptian leaders, to counsel with the priest, as there were the acceptances of those influences through the experience. The entity was in the Atlantean land, when there were those periods of necessity of the groups being separated, owing to the upheavals, as were being brought by the sons of Belial, in using spiritual forces for self-gratification, self-indulgence. The entity was among the children of the law of one, and among those that went first to the Pyrenees, then to the Egyptian land, where there were, with those periods of purification, the attempts of the teacher, or leader to unify the activities.